Chapter 30. Waymarket State Penitentiary rose against the horizon like a cement factory from hell. Two concentric fences 10 feet high surrounded the property, topped by razor-sharp loops of concertina wire that sparkled prettily and dangerously in the sunlight. A year earlier, some prisoners on an outdoor work detail had started a brush fire, and the building's exterior still bore streaks and leaping shadows charred into its surface, giving it a mottled, medieval appearance. Even with the siren going, and Hansen ignoring every speed limit to indulge his inner Andretti, it had taken them almost 2 hours to get to Waymarket from Lobo's Nod. There were no closer prisons that could handle an inmate of Billy Dent's caliber. Billy had cut several deals with the prosecutors. Most of them had to do with keeping the state or federal government from injecting a lethal dose of chemicals into his bloodstream as due punishment for his crimes. But his last deal had guaranteed that he would serve his time and die behind bars of old age at Waymarket, the closest penitentiary to Lobo's Nod. Some my boy can visit, he'd told the lawyers. Jazz hadn't bothered. And now? "So," Hansen said, speaking for the first time since they'd left G. Williams' office. Waymarket loomed ahead of them, growing larger. "So, Jazz was in no mood for small talk. "Want to join me?" he asked Hansen. "Jesus, no," the deputy blurted out. Then he recovered and said, that's probably not a good idea." Outside the penitentiary, a group of 3 people, 2 women and a man, stood together, hoisting protest signs and stomping their feet rhythmically. As Hansen pulled the cruiser closer, Jazz realized that the signs and the trio's matching t-shirts all said the same thing: "Free Billy Dent." So, here were the lunatics who thought Billy had been framed, his confessions coerced. Jazz had read about them on the internet, but he'd never actually seen any of them. It was a nationwide movement, apparently. Jazz was grateful they could only muster 3 morons at a time. "Idiots," Hansen muttered under his breath. A corrections officer waved them through the 2 fences and guided them to a small parking lot against a cinder block wall that still bore a peaked tattoo from last year's fire. Another corrections officer met them at the entrance and pointed out a lounge to Hansen. Jazz was escorted directly to the warden's office. "You're sure about this?" the warden asked. He had a tall, thick build that made Jazz think, for some reason, of a rhinoceros. He seemed like he was clenching all of his muscles all the time, constantly on alert. And he regarded Jazz with suspicion. Did he think Jazz was Billy's conspirator in the Impressionist crimes? Or was it just a matter of suspicion as survival, surrounded as he was daily by some of the most dangerous men in the state? "I'm sure," Jazz said. The warden shook his head. "Billy hasn't agreed to seeing anyone in the 4 years we've had him. The last person he saw was one of his lawyers. I didn't think he would agree to see even you, but he surprised me. I can't stop you from seeing him, but I can do everything possible to warn you." "Billy won't hurt me," Jazz said with more confidence than he actually felt. He didn't know what Billy might do, truthfully. And besides, Billy had ways of hurting that went beyond the physical. He could cause pain without a touch. "You need to be careful around this guy," the warden said. "He's a master manipulator and one of the best liars I've ever seen. A real PhD in slinging high-grade horse manure. You catch me?" If Jazz had been in a better mood, he might have appreciated the comedy in the very thought of the warden warning him, of all people, of the dangers of Billy Dent. "If Billy Dent told me so much as his name," the warden went on, "I'd check his birth certificate to be sure." He gazed at Jazz for an amount of time that would have intimidated or spooked most people. But Jazz wasn't most people. He just stared back. He admitted a grudging respect for the fact that the warden didn't back down. He'd been taught his stare by dear old Dad, and very few people could stand it for long without becoming flustered at the very least. "I'll ask you again. You sure you want to do this, kid? Jazz shrugged lazily. Inside, he had swallowed a potent cocktail of terror and thrill. The thought of seeing his father again scared the hell out of him, but also made him feel somehow more alive. He supposed this was what skydivers felt just before they pulled the ripcord, but he wasn't about to let anyone, least of all the warden, know that. The warden snorted. Fine, let's do her. Moments later, Jazz found himself with the warden and a couple of corrections officers in a small gray room, sitting at a metal table that was bolted to the concrete floor. The chairs, he noticed, were also bolted down. The walls were made of unpainted cinder blocks. Jazz remembered reading about a prison where they had painted the walls in pastels, thinking the colors would calm the inmates. Instead, the inmates had peeled the paint off the walls and eaten it. There were 2 doors, dull metal affairs set into perpendicular walls. Jazz had come through one, and he knew what would be coming through the other. A single, narrow, barred window would have let in sunlight from up near the ceiling had the day not been overcast and gray. Instead, the only light came from a naked bulb dangling from the high ceiling. Jazz calculated quickly. If he stood on the table, he could probably snatch the bulb. Could he break it into a serviceable weapon before anyone could stop him? He thought he could. He was pretty damn sure he could. Jazz tightened his grip on the edge of the table until the blood drained from his fingers. You don't need a weapon, he told himself. You don't need... Wakey, wakey. Do it. Don't be nervous, kid, the warden said, mistaking Jazz's white knuckles for nerves, not restraint. My men'll make sure you're safe. I'm fine, he replied. You always accompany your prisoner's guests? The warden burst out laughing. For such a big, impressive man, he had a surprisingly high and trembly laugh. Jazz found himself wanting to rip out the man's larynx. Kill that growly laugh. Instead, he smiled his best, most polite smile and pretended that he didn't want to kill the guy. A buzzer sounded. Through a barred slot at eye level in the second door, Jazz saw a CO's face. Prisoner, the man barked. The warden nodded, and one of the COs in the room opened that door. The barking CO entered the room and stepped aside. Jazz laid his eyes on his father in the flesh, for the first time in 4 years. Billy Dent looked happy. His mouth was twisted in a wire grin, his eyes wide and slight with what some people, none of them in this room, might mistake for an impish glee. He carried himself with a loose swagger, as if he expected music to strike up at any moment, and he was trying to decide if he would dance or not. He wore bright orange prison-issue pants and a matching shirt, unbuttoned, with a clean white t-shirt underneath. Jazz had somehow expected Billy to be grimy, filthy, covered with soot and cinder and dust. Instead, he was disappointed to see that Billy looked like he'd just come from a shower, to a wardrobe of fresh laundry. His sandy blonde hair, no longer shaved, and a bit longer than Jazz had ever seen it, was clean and combed back. Welcome, Billy, the warden said with a sneer. This here's the visitor's room. Figure I need to introduce it to you since you haven't had any use for it. Billy shuffled in. He was shackled hand and foot. He had roughly 3 inches of play between his wrists, maybe 5 inches between his ankles. A longer chain ran between the ones binding his limbs, just short enough that he had to stoop an inch. He jangled. Another CO stood behind him. So, 2 had come in with him. 2 were already here, and there was the warden. 5 men between Billy and Jazz. And Jazz still felt like Billy was in control of the room. His father stared straight at him, that smile still twisting his lips, that light in his eyes never dimming. Read 'em the riot act, the warden said to the lead CO, and then he left the room. Now it's fun time, Billy, the CO said, his voice no nonsense. I'm only going to tell you this once, so y'all listen careful, okay? Here's how it's going to be. You're going to sit in this here seat. I'm going to shackle you to the table. Me and my men will be on the other side of that there door." He pointed. Jas watched his father's eyes. They didn't move at all. Billy was still staring at him. It was as though Jas were the only other person in the room. "The door ain't going to be locked. I want you to pretend there's an invisible fence halfway down that table, right smack in the middle. You touch that fence, you lean forward too much, and we're going to come through that door, and we're going to hurt you, Billy. Now, I don't mean we're going to hit you with the clubs or give you the taser. It's going to be a big hurt, Billy. A bad hurt. It's going to go on a long time. Your boy here will be home in bed, and it'll still be going on, see? I'm trying to impress upon ye all how serious this hurtin' is going to be. Do we understand each other?" Without removing his gaze from Jas, Billy Dent nodded once. The lead guard looked over at Jas again. "You sure about this, kid?" Jas didn't trust his voice all of a sudden. He nodded exactly like his father had. Realized what he was doing. Nodded a second time just to be different. Then cursed himself for showing weakness to dear old Dad. The guard sat Billy down and locked his wrist chain to the table. Billy folded his hands in front of him. And then Jas was alone with his father, the two of them staring at each other across the table, separated by no more than 2 feet of empty air and an imaginary fence. "Is it Father's Day already?" Bill asked jovially, as if no time at all had passed. As if it hadn't been 4 years. Jas weighed his words carefully. Billy Dent came across like some sort of bumpkin or redneck idiot, but nothing could be further from the truth. His IQ had tested off the charts. He had driven 2 psychiatrists, one with the FBI, one with the victims' rights group, to quit their profession. He was pure brilliance and pure evil in one package, and woe be to anyone who forgot this when talking to him. "So this is funny to you?" Jas asked, keeping his tone even, bland. "You're amused?" Billy craned his neck left, then right, producing an audible crack. "Life amuses me, Jasper. Until it don't no more," he grinned. "When you're a happy guy, you find amusement in all kinds of places. Even in here." "There was a shrink on TV once," Jas said evenly. "Said you would probably kill yourself in prison." Billy chuckled. "Kill myself? And destroy all of this?" He couldn't gesture well with his shackled hands, so he nodded his head around the room. "The state, the universe. Still, I'm surprised you're in one piece. I thought there was a pecking order in prison." "There sure is." Billy leaned back and guffawed. "Oh, there's one hell of a pecking order, and your dear old daddy sits right up around the top. You got triple digits next to your name. They sort of king you in here, like in checkers, you follow? I figured someone would shank you. Try to prove he's a big man by knocking off Billy Dent." "Well, now," Billy's slow drawl became even more syrupy. "I ain't saying there ain't been no, what you call 'em, altercations in the past couple years. There's definitely been what I'd call a breaking in period." He produced a smile that, to anyone else, would have seemed full of genuine warmth. Jas remembered it from the night Billy had shown him how to saw through a knee joint in under 5 minutes. "First, you gotta get under the kneecap, what your doctors and such call the patella, see? But now me and the folks in here get along just fine. They get me and I get them. Prison ain't so bad for people like us, Jasper." Too late. Jas tried to keep his spine from stiffening at the comment, but he'd reacted already, and Billy had seen it. Had seen that he'd crawled right under Jas's skin. Jas bit back the expected retort. "I'm nothing like you," because he knew Billy already had a counterattack ready. "I'm glad you're doing well," he said instead, and pretended to mean it.